I still remember the exact bite of that Colorado night in 1993. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs when I drew in a breath, and the mountains loomed like cold witnesses to what was about to happen. I stood on the porch of my parents' house with a suitcase at my feet, my hand tight around the handle as if that grip could anchor me to the life I had known. The porch light burned yellow against the darkness, but it did nothing to warm the moment. Inside, laughter floated through the walls, my siblings joking around the dinner table, the sound of cutlery and the smell of roasted chicken drifting through the cracked window. For a moment I hesitated, hoping that sound meant I could still be part of it. Then my mother opened the door. Her face, Eulalia's face, was set hard, like stone carved by years of disapproval. She didn't greet me, she didn't smile. She simply said, "Don't bother our house. Come back in 30 years. I froze. At first, I thought I had misheard. 30 years. It wasn't a warning or even an argument. It was a sentence. My father stood behind her, not meeting my eyes, just staring down at the floor. I tried to smile, to laugh it off as some cruel joke, but nothing about the moment allowed humor. Shame burned through me, and silence swallowed every word I wanted to say. In that instant, everything I thought I knew about family collapsed. I had always believed home was permanent, that even in conflict it stood as a place where you could return. But that night, I learned permanence could be revoked with a single line. The door opened just wide enough for me to catch a glimpse of the dinner table. My younger brother raised a glass, and Bryony, my older sister, laughed loud enough for me to hear. For them, life moved forward, while I stood outside with my suitcase, humiliated and shivering. "Mom, wait!" I tried, my voice breaking in the cold air. "I just want to—" She raised her hand, sharp and dismissive. "This isn't your place anymore." Then she pulled the door closer, her eyes flicking to my father as if daring him to speak. He didn't. The sound came next, the latch clicking, the heavy echo of rejection slamming into me harder than the wooden panel itself. It was the kind of sound that doesn't fade with time. I stood there for what felt like an hour. The cold seeped through my coat, but I didn't move. Inside, they laughed, clinked glasses, and carried on like I had never been part of that house. The smell of roasted chicken taunted me. My chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself, but my mouth stayed shut. I wanted to scream, to pound the door, to force them to see me. Instead, I stood in silence, because silence felt safer than begging for recognition I wasn't going to get. The next day, against my better judgment, I came back. I told myself maybe they had cooled down, that maybe the night before had been the result of some heat-of-the-moment cruelty. I didn't knock on the door this time. I stood by the side window, peeking in like a thief of my own past. The first thing I noticed was the wall by the piano. When I was 8, I had painted a clumsy watercolor of the mountains behind our house. My father had framed it and insisted it hang right there, a small token of pride. That painting had stayed on that wall through birthdays, holidays, and arguments. But when I looked in that morning, it was gone. In its place hung Bryony's framed diploma, polished, matted, and perfectly centered. I pressed my hand against the cold glass of the window. My eyes scanned the room, searching desperately. Where was it? I finally spotted it near the corner, dumped in a storage box alongside worn-out decorations and broken toys. My painting, my colors, reduced to clutter. The sting wasn't just in seeing it replaced, it was in the message. Even my colors weren't welcome on their walls. I whispered to myself, the words catching in my throat. Home is where the heart is, but only if your heart is allowed in. That was the moment I understood erasure. It wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, strategic, deliberate. Piece by piece, they had chosen to overwrite me. Bryony's diploma wasn't just a certificate, it was a replacement. Her pride was the new family portrait, while my small contribution was buried under the weight of things no longer useful. I turned away from the window, the chill of the glass still on my palm. I walked down the street with my suitcase rattling behind me. Every step echoed the realization that my place in that family had been carefully, meticulously stripped away. Now, 30 years later, I sit here as a woman of 58, and those words still echo. 30 years is a long time, but memory doesn't dull when the wound is cut that deep. I often think about how in this country we preach family values, how we speak of family as the foundation of everything. We teach our children that a home should be a refuge, a place of belonging. But what happens when the family itself becomes the source of exile? That's not a sermon most churches want to deliver, but it's a reality many Americans carry in silence. 30 years, I repeat to myself sometimes. They told me 30 years. I marked every one of them. Each year wasn't just another number, it was a tally etched into my resolve. They thought time would erase the memory, but instead, it became my clock. And so, when I finally walked back to that door, 30 winters later, I carried more than just a suitcase. I carried silence sharpened into a weapon, and I carried the knowledge of what it means to be erased by your own blood. The porch light looked weaker than I remembered, as if time itself had dimmed it. The house in front of me was the same shape, the same wood siding, but something felt smaller about it now, less welcoming. My boots pressed into the packed snow, the crunch loud in the still night. My breath came out in clouds, little bursts of nerves that I tried to steady. I stood there gripping the handle of my suitcase, the weight pulling at my hand. It was more than luggage. It was years, decades of silence and exile collected in one place. I whispered to myself. After 30 years, I told myself they would soften. Maybe time could heal. Saying it out loud felt foolish, even as the words left me. The front door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there, hair white now, shoulders still squared with the authority she carried my whole life. Her eyes scanned me quickly, not softening, not widening in surprise. Just cold calculation, as if measuring how long I might last before leaving again. "I thought you'd be older," she said finally. "I am," I answered. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the key my father had once pressed into my hand when I was young. I held it out like an offering, like a ticket back to a place I thought was still partly mine. "I kept this all these years," I said, hoping she would see it as a gesture of belonging. She looked down at it and scoffed. "Throw it away. That key doesn't open anything here anymore." Her words sliced sharper than the wind. My fingers slackened and the key slipped, striking the porch with a metallic clink before disappearing into the snow. I stood still, frozen in more ways than one. Inside, my father sat in his old armchair, staring at the television without glancing toward me. He didn't protest, didn't greet me, didn't acknowledge the key. It was as though I was a delivery woman dropping something at the door. I tried to laugh softly, to mask the sting. "You know, Dad gave me that key. I thought maybe it still counted." Mother's lips pressed together into a thin line. "It never counted as much as you thought." Then she turned her back and left the doorway, leaving me to step inside only because the cold pushed me in. The house smelled faintly of pine cleaner and cooked beef. The floor creaked in the same places, yet I felt like a trespasser in a museum where my picture had been scratched off the exhibits. That evening, neighbors came by, bringing over a casserole and cheer, part of their routine of visiting my parents. I sat quietly near the hall, waiting, telling myself maybe someone would notice me. The introduction started as usual. My mother beamed at Bryony, who had arrived early, draped in her newest coat. "This is Bryony, our daughter, the one who's always been our pride." I straightened a little, waiting for my name. My father added, "Yes, Bryony's done so well, everyone knows her." Then a neighbor glanced my way. "And who's this?" My mother's smile faltered, then she answered quickly, "She's just visiting." No name, no relation, just visiting. The neighbor nodded, awkward, offering me a polite smile before turning back to Bryony. The conversation carried on as if I were invisible. I sat there, swallowing the burn rising in my chest. If my name was too heavy for their tongue, then I had truly vanished. After the neighbors left, I confronted them quietly. "Why didn't you introduce me properly?" Mother waved her hand dismissively. "It's easier this way." "Easier for who?" I pressed. "For everyone," she replied, her tone flat as if that settled the matter. The silence after that was heavier than shouting. Bryony smirked slightly, sipping her tea, pleased to watch me diminished. Later, in the quiet of my old room, which was no longer mine, stripped bare, filled with generic guest furniture, I sat on the bed staring at the wallpaper. I thought about how in America, introductions matter, names matter, they define belonging. In this country, I whispered to myself, if you don't get named, you don't exist. The cold welcome I had received was worse than the slammed door 3 decades earlier. Back then, at least they had spoken my name before banishing me. Now I was erased without a sound. I realized then they hadn't just locked me out. They had written me out. The next morning, I wandered slowly through the living room, still raw from the way my mother had introduced me as just visiting. I tried to calm myself by focusing on the details of the house, to remind myself that I had once belonged here. The floor creaked in the same spots. The smell of old pine cleaner lingered, yet the walls told another story. I scanned them one by one. Bryony's framed diploma gleamed under perfect lighting, centered above the mantel as if it were the crown jewel. My younger brother's soccer trophies filled a glass case. Photographs of graduations, weddings, and grandchildren formed a gallery that looked curated with care. I waited for my eyes to land on a trace of me. It wasn't there. For a moment, I thought maybe my picture had been moved to another wall. I searched carefully, each step echoing. Finally, near the basement door, I found a cardboard box stacked with holiday decorations. I crouched down, lifted the lid, and there it was, my childhood photo, once framed in oak, now stripped and tossed among tangled strings of lights. I whispered, almost involuntarily. To them, my face belonged in a box, not on their walls. The realization hit me harder than the cold porch 30 years ago. Erasure wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, meticulous, as if my existence had been filed away under miscellaneous. I touched the edge of the photo, dust gathering on my fingers, and wondered if my parents had even noticed when they decided to replace it. Later that afternoon, I sat on the couch staring at the wall where the photo had once hung. Americans treat family pictures like proof of life. Neighbors I knew filled entire hallways with portraits of their children, every milestone frozen in time. My absence from that wall wasn't an oversight. It was a declaration. You erase a picture, I said aloud. You erase a story. The truth lodged heavy in my chest. It wasn't just about losing a frame on the wall. It was about being denied a chapter in the family narrative. My father walked by just then. He paused, saw me holding the photo, but didn't speak. His silence was permission for the absence to remain. Dinner that evening was even harder. The table was full, everyone gathered, voices overlapping. My mother lifted her glass. To Bryony, she said proudly. Our pride, our success story. Bryony beamed. My father nodded solemnly. At least one child carried the family name well. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. They didn't look at me. They didn't acknowledge me. My own children, grown, hardworking, were nowhere in the conversation. My years of keeping myself afloat, of building a life without them, meant nothing. I sat silently as Bryony basked in their praise. I remembered Theodore Roosevelt's words I once read. Comparison is the thief of joy. Tonight, that thief sat at my table in the form of my parents' words. When the toast ended, I tried to interject gently. You know, my daughter just... My mother cut me off with a tight smile. That's wonderful, but Bryony's news really deserves the spotlight tonight. My daughter's achievement died in my throat. I lowered my eyes to my plate, cheeks burning, pulse racing. My silence protected me from making a scene, but inside the anger smoldered. Later that night, as laughter echoed around the table, I realized erasure was worse than outright rejection. Rejection is loud. You hear the no and you can fight it. Erasure is silence, a slow death of memory. Their cruelty wasn't passive. It was deliberate, sharpened over years. They hadn't forgotten me by accident. They had rewritten the family story without me in it. I lay awake in the spare room, staring at the ceiling, my fists clenched at my sides. Pain twisted into something steadier. If they thought silence would bury me, they were wrong. That night, I whispered into the darkness. As laughter echoed without my name, I began to plot my own echo. That evening, the house was dressed for dinner in a way that made my chest tighten. The dining room table gleamed, polished to perfection, set with heavy plates and silverware that caught the light from the chandelier above. It should have been a moment of comfort, but instead I felt a faint unease coil around me. "Come sit," my mother said, her tone clipped, her eyes already darting to where she wanted me. I looked around. At the head of the table sat my father, stiff-backed, as though still guarding a throne. To his right, Bryony's place was adorned with a folded linen napkin and a crystal glass. My younger brother's spot was filled with the same careful attention. But the chair reserved for me was not part of that symmetrical circle. It was pushed awkwardly against the wall, squeezed between the swinging kitchen door and the trash bin. I paused at the sight, hoping someone would realize how ridiculous it looked. In America, I thought bitterly, where you sit at the table says everything about your place in the family. "Sit there," my mother ordered, pointing toward the chair by the door. "It's easier for you." Easier for them, I thought. Easier to forget me. Easier to push me aside with every clang of plates coming from the kitchen. The seat was humiliating. Each time the kitchen door swung open, it brushed against my shoulder. The trash bin gave off a faint odor that mixed poorly with the roast beef my mother had prepared. Conversation flowed easily between those at the main table, but I was cut off, positioned like a servant waiting for scraps. I tried to keep my expression steady, but I could feel Bryony watching me with quiet satisfaction. She leaned toward me slightly and whispered, "You'll get used to it." I didn't answer. The meal began with a toast. My mother lifted her glass, and the room fell into a practiced hush. "To Bryony," she announced proudly, "our pride, our success story." My father nodded. "Of course, we still keep her state award certificate framed in the study." Bryony laughed modestly, though her eyes sparkled at the attention. "Oh, that was so long ago." I opened my mouth to add something, to mention my own daughter's recent accomplishment, but my voice was drowned out by another wave of praise. "Remember when you led that project at the hospital?" My mother continued. "Yes," Bryony said with a smile. "It was one of the best moments of my career." I tried again. "Actually, Pass the rolls," my brother interrupted, and the conversation shifted without pause. I closed my mouth. The words I had carried all day with pride died in my throat. I could feel heat rising in my cheeks, my pulse hammering at the injustice of it. Even at their table, my words were being cleared away like crumbs. I glanced down at my plate, focusing on the pattern of the china to steady myself. Inside, however, resentment simmered, building with each dismissive laugh. The dinner stretched on, a parade of stories where Bryony and my brother shone like the stars of a stage play. I was the forgotten prop, shoved to the wings. Not once did they ask about my life, my work, or my family. Every attempt I made was brushed aside, redirected, or ignored. By the time dessert was served, I had stopped trying. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, watching as my family celebrated themselves. Later, alone in the guest room, I turned the scene over and over in my mind. Families wound each other not always with fists, but with chairs and silences. Tonight, they had told me without words exactly where I belonged. In the margins, by the door, close to the trash. In America, I reminded myself, the dinner table is supposed to be sacred. Here, it was a battlefield. Their cruelty wasn't clumsy. It was deliberate, sharpened with every toast, every ignored sentence, every seat placement. That night, I told myself, if they kept me at the edge, I would find a way to stand at the center, on my own terms. It was late in the afternoon when I wandered into the living room, still shaken from the dinner the night before. The air in the house was unnervingly still, almost too quiet. That's when I noticed a stack of folders lying neatly on the coffee table. The kind of folders that never belonged in plain sight. They were heavy-looking, bound with clips, and the tops of official seals peeked out from under the flaps. I heard murmurs from the kitchen, my mother's voice low, sharp, deliberate, and Bryony's laugh, that practiced polite chuckle I had grown to despise. "I don't want her confused about it anymore," my mother said. "Don't worry," Bryony answered softly. "She won't stand in the way. You've made sure of it." My stomach tightened as I stepped closer. I glanced down at the folders, the edges crisp, stamped with notary markings. The ink, the stamps, they carried an authority more cutting than any raised voice. Words shouted at a dinner table fade. Ink on paper carves the truth into permanence. I stood frozen, every instinct telling me not to open them, but dread and curiosity kept me tethered. These weren't just papers. They were decisions about me, made without me. Later, as the voices from the kitchen grew louder, I caught the words that snapped something inside me. "The house is yours," my mother whispered to Bryony, her tone warm and proud. "We've made sure she has no rights." Bryony's soft laugh followed, smug and certain. "I always knew you'd do the right thing." I covered my mouth, holding back a gasp. They hadn't even tried to hide it. My exile had a signature now. I turned back toward the folders, staring at them like they were weapons laid out for display. My name wasn't simply ignored anymore. It was deliberately cut out, replaced with the name of the daughter they wanted. For a moment, I felt weak, like the air had been knocked out of me. I thought of families across this country, the way siblings quietly fought over wills, estates, and heirlooms, tearing bonds that could never be stitched back together. This was the American reality no one wanted to admit. Money and property could gut loyalty faster than betrayal itself. Hours later, when the house had gone quiet and I was sure no one was looking, I returned to the table. The folders were still there, stacked with unnerving neatness. My hand trembled as I opened one. There it was, black ink on white paper. A legal will. My eyes raced through the sentences until I found my name. Crossed out. Next to it, the language was blunt, sterile, merciless. She has no rights to this property. I read it again and again, as though repetition might alter the words. But they stayed fixed, colder than the winter air outside. My hands shook so badly that the pages crinkled. The weight of the document felt heavier than any stone I had ever carried. "Not only did they shut me out," I whispered, voice cracking, "they wrote me out." I sank into the couch, the paper trembling between my fingers. It was one thing to feel unwanted, to hear words of dismissal over and over. But this was legal exile. Signed, stamped, permanent. There's a saying I once heard, "Paper cuts are invisible until they bleed." That day, I understood it fully. The wound was invisible to the world, but deep enough to keep me awake at night. I thought about my neighbors again, the ones who framed their children's lives in pictures on the wall. My family had framed me in ink that erased me, documents that buried me alive. And yet, as the sun set outside and the papers grew blurry in the dim light, something inside me shifted. The humiliation didn't crush me. It hardened me. I leaned back, pressing the will flat against the table, staring at the bold lettering. If they wanted to play this game with papers and signatures, then I would find my own pen, my own ink. That night, I murmured into the silence, I stopped being their daughter on paper, but in silence, I began becoming something else, my own authority. The staircase creaked beneath my steps as I climbed, guided more by memory than sight. I knew every dip in those boards, every squeak that once woke my father late at night. I had imagined this walk for decades, thinking it might bring comfort, maybe a rush of nostalgia. But when I reached the hallway and turned the handle of my old room, what greeted me stripped away any trace of belonging. The door opened into a space that wasn't mine. Where my posters once hung, now there were mismatched boxes stacked haphazardly. A treadmill pressed against the wall, cords dangling loosely. Children's toys, Bryony's children's toys, overflowed from bins, crowding the corners. My bed was gone, replaced with a fold-out couch. The room I once claimed, where I had cried over teenage heartbreak and dreamed of futures bigger than this house, had been repurposed without hesitation. I stood frozen, staring at the treadmill's blinking light. Bryony walked up behind me, her voice lilting with false cheer. "Oh, I use this space now. You didn't need it, right?" I turned slowly, my hand still on the doorknob. "Didn't need it?" My voice was low, but the disbelief ran sharp. Bryony shrugged. "You left. Life went on. The room had to be useful for someone." She said it with the ease of someone discussing clutter, not the rewriting of another's history. My chest tightened. The last physical tie to my childhood had been overwritten with plastic bins and sweat-stained exercise mats. The room once mine was now someone else's story. As I stepped into the hallway, trying to compose myself, I heard them before they noticed me. My mother's voice cut through, sharp and unyielding. "Raising her was a waste," she said to Bryony. "She gave nothing back." The words stopped me cold. Bryony responded softly, "You don't have to be so harsh." "It's the truth," my mother muttered. "All those years and for what?" Nothing. I stood just outside their view, my hands trembling so badly I had to press them against the wall to steady myself. I had been called many things in my life, but waste landed like no insult ever had. Waste is for garbage, not for a daughter. I could have stormed into the room, screamed, demanded they take it back. Instead, I stayed still. They wouldn't see tears. They wouldn't see me collapse. Inside, Bryony's voice lowered. "She's here now. Maybe this is a chance." My mother's reply was swift. "She doesn't deserve another chance. Not after everything." The heat rose in my throat, my nails digging into my palms. Yet I swallowed it all, locking it inside. If silence was what they wanted from me, I would give them silence, but not surrender. I walked back to the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed, the thin mattress sagging beneath me. I stared at the plain curtains, listening to the muffled voices in the hall. My breath came shallow, but my mind began to sharpen. Direct confrontation wouldn't work. They held the deed, the walls, the narrative. Every room in this house echoed with their authority. But I had something else: patience, memory, strategy. "They think silence means defeat," I whispered to myself. For me, silence is a ledger. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed every insult, every gesture, every legal document I had glimpsed. I etched it into my mind like entries in an account book. Each slight added to a balance they didn't know they were building. In America, family battles rarely erupt in fists. They are fought in property lines, wills, and quiet exclusions. Not with shouts, but with omissions. The strong aren't always the loudest. They are often the ones who wait. I realized my strength wasn't in begging for a seat or reclaiming a room filled with boxes. My strength was in clarity, in endurance, in outlasting them. Anger hardened into something colder, sharper. If they thought my silence meant surrender, they would learn soon enough that silence was only the beginning of my resistance. That afternoon I stepped outside, needing air thicker than the stale tension that lingered inside those walls. The cold wrapped around me, but it felt cleaner than the stifling silence my family used as a weapon. I walked down the path, crunching through patches of old snow, trying to loosen the anger sitting in my chest. "Thessaly?" a voice called, warm and startled at once. I turned to see Ismini, our old neighbor, bundled in a heavy coat. Her hair was silver now, her back slightly bent, but her eyes still sharp with recognition. "I knew it was you," she said, approaching with a cautious smile. "After all these years, you're back." I nodded, too surprised to form words at first. She studied me, her expression softening. "I still remember when your father promised this house to you. Do you?" The words hit like a blow I wasn't prepared for. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't speak. I managed a whisper. "He said that?" Ismeni tilted her head, almost scolding. "Of course. He told me once, while fixing the fence, that you'd be the one to inherit this place. Said you loved it more than anyone." My chest ached. All these years I had wondered if I had imagined my importance, if my memory had exaggerated his kindness. Yet here it was, spoken back to me by someone who had no reason to lie. I swallowed hard. I thought I dreamed it. Everyone made me feel like I'd made it all up. Ismini reached into her bag and pulled out a faded folder. "I kept this by chance, thought it might matter someday." I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a photocopy of a will draft, my name clearly listed as heir. The sight of it sent a rush through me. Shock, validation, a bitter reminder of what had been stolen. I clutched the paper as if it were oxygen. So I wasn't imagining it, I muttered to myself. I was never crazy. They changed the story. Ismani placed a hand on my arm. Families rewrite things when it suits them. Don't let them erase what you know to be true. Her words grounded me, but the paper itself was the proof. In America, estate documents weren't just ink, they were weapons. And in my hand, I held the first real defense I had touched in 30 years. That evening, I carried the photocopy into the house, my pulse steady but sharp. I tucked it away carefully, knowing its weight. Soon after, Adelpha, a distant cousin, stopped by for tea. She was always polite, never dramatic, but that night she lingered after the others had left. She leaned toward me, lowering her voice. I need to tell you something. Your father wanted you to have this house. It was his intention from the beginning. I blinked, caught between hope and suspicion. Then why wasn't it so? Adelpha sighed, eyes flicking toward the hallway to make sure no one was listening. Because your mother opposed it. She thought you weren't dependable enough. That's why the papers were changed. She convinced him. The bitterness rushed back, sharp and choking. My own mother, not just siblings, had made sure I was erased. She thought I wasn't dependable? I repeated, my voice low. I left, and I stood on my own for 30 years. I raised my children, worked, built a life without their help. But I'm the one who wasn't dependable? Adelpha looked at me with pity. I thought you should know. I nodded, though rage thrummed under my skin. Thank you. You're right. I needed to hear it. When she left, I sat alone, staring at the folded photocopy in my lap. The truth was like mold behind painted walls, hidden, festering, spreading until it cracked the surface. My family thought they had buried the past, but here I was, holding its proof. I whispered to myself, steady and cold. The truth always leaves a paper trail. That night, my shock settled into something harder. I no longer carried just memory, I carried evidence. They thought the past was buried. I was holding its proof in my hands. Sunday morning came cold and bright, the air crisp with the kind of winter sharpness that makes you pull your scarf tighter. My family walked into the local church together, every step rehearsed like we were still the picture-perfect household we wanted people to believe. My mother led the way, Bryony at her side, her arm looped through Mother's like a trophy on display. I trailed behind them, invisible in the line, carrying the weight of being back in a place where even God's house didn't feel like sanctuary. The fellowship hall buzzed with voices and laughter. Tables groaned under potluck dishes, neighbors hugged one another, and the scent of coffee mingled with casseroles. For a moment, I whispered to myself, maybe here, in front of others, they would show some pride. I held on to that sliver of hope like a lifeline, thinking they wouldn't dare shame me under stained glass and the watchful eyes of the community. But I should have known better. Introductions began as the pastor welcomed everyone. My mother's voice cut through the chatter, proud and deliberate. She gestured toward Bryony. This is Bryony, our daughter, our pride. Applause followed, nods of approval from the neighbors. Then came the pause, the glance in my direction. And Thessaly, she said, her voice curdled with disdain. She never really belonged here. The words detonated in the room. Gasps echoed, and a hush fell heavy. A neighbor leaned to another, whispering too loud to be hidden. Did she just say that about her own child? My mother's lips curled into a smile as cold as the wind outside. Some truths are better said aloud, she answered smoothly, as though cruelty were honesty. I stood rooted in place, my breath caught like a stone in my chest. In America, parents may scold their children, may even criticize them in front of others, but rarely do they disown them publicly. This wasn't correction. It wasn't tough love. It was execution of my name, my belonging, my dignity, in front of witnesses who mattered. Every eye turned toward me. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed for me. Others lingered with curiosity, pity mixed in. My father said nothing, sipping his coffee as if words had not just buried me alive. Bryony's smirk was subtle, but it glinted like glass under the lights. Inside, I burned with rage, but my face stayed steady. The humiliation seared into me, branding me in the one place meant to heal. When the service ended and neighbors mingled, I stayed near the edge of the hall, not trusting my voice. That's when Ismini found me, her hand resting gently on my arm. "You don't deserve this," she said, eyes firm with empathy. "They've been cruel for too long." Her words were soft but powerful, a lifeline when the ground threatened to collapse beneath me. I nodded, unable to form much more than a whisper. "Thank you." "Sometimes it takes a village," she said, leaning closer, "even if your family refuses." I exhaled, realizing in that moment that validation doesn't always come from blood. Sometimes it comes from witnesses, those who refuse to look away when cruelty is displayed in plain sight. Walking home later, I replayed every second. The humiliation had been sharp, unbearable, but it was also public. Neighbors saw, the town saw. And in that exposure, my mother had not just tried to erase me, she had exposed her own malice. Families often believe silence protects them, but humiliation in public is a weapon that can cut the wielder as well. My mother had chosen the wrong stage. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling in the guest room, the words returned like a drumbeat. They had tried to bury me with shame, but instead, they had planted something else, resolve, burning and undeniable. "They tried to bury me with shame," I whispered into the darkness. Instead, they planted the seed of my rebellion. When I closed the door to the guest room that evening after the church gathering, the words still rang in my ears. She never belonged here. They followed me like shadows, sticking to my skin long after the service had ended. I sank into the chair by the window, hands trembling, breath shallow, my body heavy with the weight of 30 years. I had thought the cold outside was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the chill of being erased in front of my entire community. I pressed my palms against my knees, trying to steady myself. My chest felt tight, as though every insult was lodged there, refusing to leave. The walls of that house seemed to lean in, suffocating me with silence. They always say in this country that words don't hurt, that actions matter more. But standing there, my family's words had carved deeper than any knife. Words don't bruise skin, they bruise memory. I sat for a long while in the dim light, the air colder than the snow outside, replaying my mother's voice over and over until it blurred into a dull roar. For once, I felt the fight inside me flicker, almost extinguished. That night, for the first time since I'd returned, I broke. Tears came quietly, the kind that roll without sound, hidden even from myself. I curled forward, pressing my forehead against my folded arms so no one in the house would hear. "They stripped me in front of everyone," I whispered. "How do I even breathe here?" I tried to steady my breathing, but each inhale cut like glass. Public humiliation had a way of digging deeper than private insults. In private, you could swallow it, pretend it never happened. In public, it was witnessed, branded into the memory of an entire community. For a fleeting moment, I thought about leaving, packing my bag, walking out the door, and never looking back. But then I froze. Wouldn't that just mean running again, the same way I had 30 years ago when they first pushed me out? Walking away now would give them the story they wanted, that I was weak, unreliable, unfit to carry the family legacy. I couldn't let them write that ending for me. The next day, restless and still raw, I wandered down to the basement looking for solitude. It was musty, the air heavy with the scent of dust and forgotten things. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, their labels faded. My eyes drifted across them until I spotted one with my name faintly scribbled in black marker. I knelt down and dragged it closer, heart pounding as though I were about to open a coffin. The cardboard resisted, but finally the flaps gave way. Inside were remnants of my childhood. Old sheet music I had once practiced clumsily on the piano, a leather-bound journal with my teenage scrawl, and at the very bottom, a handmade trinket my father had carved for me, a small wooden bird, its wings spread wide. And the sight of it unraveled me. I picked it up gently, my fingers tracing the rough edges, and tears blurred my vision again. "You remembered me, Dad," I whispered. "At least once you did." The weight of the little bird in my hand was more powerful than any insult. Proof that I had mattered, even if only once, even if only to him. Americans keep heirlooms as anchors of memory. A quilt, a recipe card, a photo album, objects that say, "You were here, you mattered." For me, this box was that anchor, a reminder that I wasn't entirely erased, that a fragment of me still existed within these walls, no matter how hard they tried to deny it. I sat on the cold basement floor, the wooden bird cradled against my chest, and let myself breathe. By evening, something inside me shifted. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and stood straighter. Humiliation had cut deep, but it hadn't killed me. Holding that anchor, I realized my history was mine alone. They couldn't strip it away with words or papers. "If they see me as nothing," I murmured, steady this time, "I'll show them what nothing can become." The grief that had nearly broken me hardened into resolve. My tears dried into quiet strength, my back straightened as though I'd been carrying weight that finally transformed into armor. That night, holding my anchor in my hands, I stopped breaking. I started building my revenge. I stayed up late that night, long after the rest of the house had gone to bed. The silence pressed in, but I welcomed it. On the small desk in the guest room, I laid out every document I had quietly gathered, photocopies, drafts, things left unattended that I'd memorized line by line. The lamplight made the black ink shine in sharp contrast against the pale paper. These weren't just documents anymore. They were weapons. I recalled a conversation years ago with a lawyer friend from church. He had told me, half joking but serious underneath, "Paper cuts both ways if you know where to hold it." At the time, I thought he meant nothing more than a clever line. But now, staring at the pages, I understood the truth in it. "If they wanted to erase me with ink," I whispered to myself, "then I'll write my own ending." The words steadied me. Every line that had once condemned me now looked like a doorway. The signatures that had excluded me became proof of their arrogance. The stamps meant to finalize my absence had left trails I could follow. Documents that were meant to bury me would now carry my return. The next morning, I took the bus downtown to the county records office. I kept my coat pulled tight, the folder clutched close to my chest. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink and dust, the sound of paper shuffling like constant whispers. At the counter, a clerk in his 50s looked up over his glasses. "Can I help you?" I placed the folder gently on the counter. "I need to review the deed transfer for my family's property." He flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing. Well, technically, this isn't fully locked." I leaned forward, my heart quickening. "What do you mean?" "The taxes weren't properly settled, and there are signature inconsistencies. If you wanted to make a claim, you'd need to act fast." I met his eyes directly. Fast is exactly what I need. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, sliding the papers back. "I've seen families torn apart over less. Just know, once you do this, there's no going back." "There was no going back 30 years ago," I replied. By the time I left the office, my steps were lighter than they had been in years. For the first time, I felt the power returning, no longer the invisible daughter, but a woman holding the story in her own hands. That weekend, my mother called for a family meeting. We gathered in the living room where I had once sat as a child, listening to lectures. The air was heavy with expectation. My siblings filled the couches, and my father sat silently in his chair, eyes averted. My mother stood, her voice as sharp as ever. "We need to discuss renovations," she announced. "Bryony wants to redesign the kitchen. It's her house now, after all." My hands tightened around the small envelope I carried. I let her words hang in the air before stepping forward. "Actually," I said calmly, "that's not accurate." My mother turned, her eyes narrowing. "You're just here as a guest. Don't interfere." I steadied my breath, my voice firm. "Guests don't carry deeds. Owners do." With that, I laid the envelope on the coffee table. Papers slid out, revealing proof of what I had done. The sale of the property, finalized and legal. The room froze. My siblings leaned forward, their eyes wide. My father's lips parted, but no words came. My mother's face drained of color. "You can't," Bryony began. But I cut her off, my tone precise. "It's done. You told me 30 years ago to come back. I did. And now, this house is sold." The words landed heavy. Gasps filled the room, followed by chaos. Bryony leapt to her feet, shouting, "You can't do this! This was supposed to be mine!" My mother's voice cracked for the first time I could remember. "You wouldn't dare!" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old keys my father had once given me. Slowly, deliberately, I placed them on the table. The sound of metal against wood echoed louder than any scream. "You told me to come back in 30 years, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the panic. Well, I did. And now this chapter ends on my terms. My siblings argued, their voices rising in desperation. My mother sank into the chair, pale and silent. I looked at them all, no longer the erased daughter, no longer the guest. In that moment, I thought, I wasn't the erased daughter anymore. I was the author of the final word. The living room was frozen in silence after the keys clattered onto the table. That sound, metal against wood, was louder than any of us speaking, louder than the decades of their dismissal. My hand still hovered in the air, steady, as though daring them to deny what had just happened. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Bryony broke first. She shot to her feet, her voice cracking. "You can't do this. This isn't real. You're bluffing." I met her eyes, calm. "It's real, and it's done." My mother's lips trembled, her voice reduced to a whisper I had never heard from her before. "This was our legacy," she said, the words hollow, defeated. For years that table had been their throne, the place where every insult, every exclusion had been decreed. Now it sat between us like a witness to their downfall. The silence pressed down heavier than any shouting match ever could. Bryony began pacing, hands twisting, panic rising with each step. "All my plans, my money, my children's inheritance, you've ruined everything." Her tone bordered on hysteria, the practiced composure she wore in public crumbling into desperation. My mother collapsed into the chair behind her, staring blankly. "Not possible," she murmured, shaking her head. "Not possible, not possible." My father sat in his usual spot, but even he didn't speak. His silence wasn't dominance anymore, it was defeat. I stood straighter, watching them unravel. For once, I didn't feel small. They did. The humiliation that had always been mine now clung to them, seeping out of the walls and into the air. Neighbors would whisper, word would spread. In America, reputation can be more valuable than property, and they had lost both in a single night. The room was thick with the collapse of people who had built their identity on control. I let the silence stretch longer, then finally broke it with words that felt like steel on my tongue. "You told me to come back in 30 years, I said, measured and firm. I did. You erased me from your story, but I wrote my own ending. No yelling, no venom, just truth. And it landed harder than any raised voice. My siblings stared, their mouths opening and closing without sound. My mother's face went pale, her strength gone. My father looked at me finally, but not as a daughter. He looked at me as someone he could no longer command. Power was no longer in their words. It was in my presence. I gathered my suitcase from the corner. No rush, no fluster. I moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had already won. At the door, I paused and looked back just once. The house seemed smaller now, no longer the looming giant that had haunted me. "The house was never mine," I said softly, half to them and half to myself. But the choice was. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, but it carried freedom instead of exile. Each step away lightened me. Grief lingered, yes, but it was tempered now with something greater, liberation. I no longer needed their validation, their silence could no longer bind me. As I walked down the path, suitcase in hand, I felt the weight of 30 years finally lift. I wasn't walking away empty, I was walking away whole. I whispered into the darkness. I walked into the night with nothing left to lose and everything left to find. The night after I laid the keys on the table, I walked out of the house for the last time. The door clicked shut behind me, but this time the sound didn't sting. It freed me. I paused on the walkway, hearing the muffled chaos inside. Bryony shouting, my siblings arguing, and my mother sitting in stunned silence. Neighbors gathered at their porches, whispering as I pulled my suitcase behind me. They had witnessed the collapse, not of me, but of them. They wanted me erased, I thought, as I reached the end of the driveway. Instead, they erased themselves. The air was cold but clear, and for the first time in years, I breathed without the heaviness of their judgment pressing down. That house, once a fortress of my exclusion, now felt like nothing more than a carcass of pride. Leaving it behind wasn't loss, it was cutting the last chain. I checked into a small motel on the edge of town that night. The bedspread was thin, the heater rattled, but it felt like sanctuary because it was mine. Alone, I sat by the window and stared at the dark sky, my heart calmer than it had been in years. The knock on the door startled me. When I opened it, my mother stood there, shoulders slumped, her voice weaker than I'd ever heard. "You think you've won?" she said, her tone broken. "But you destroyed your family." I looked at her, steady. "No," I replied quietly. "You destroyed it when you chose pride over love." Her lips trembled. I was protecting what was ours. "What was ours?" I echoed. "Family isn't property. It isn't paper. It's what you failed to protect the moment you decided one child mattered more than another." She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening, but no words came. For once, I didn't need her apology. The truth itself was enough. "Sometimes," I added, "the only way to save yourself is to leave the table where love is no longer being served." I closed the door gently, not in anger but in finality. She didn't knock again. At dawn, I drove out to the Garden of the Gods overlook. The sky stretched wide, and the Rocky Mountains blazed red as the sun rose. Snow on the peaks shimmered like glass. I carried the small wooden bird my father had carved me decades ago, the anchor I had found buried in the basement. Holding it, I whispered, "This was the dawn they never thought I would live to see." The light spread slowly across the horizon, bathing the cliffs and me in warmth. I wasn't the erased daughter anymore. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a shadow trailing behind others. I was a free woman, standing in the glow of a new life. I thought about everything I had endured, the slammed doors, the erasures, the whispered wills, the public humiliations. They had all shaped me, but they no longer defined me. I turned the wooden bird over in my palm and smiled. My father, flawed as he was, had once believed I mattered enough to carve something just for me. That was my inheritance, not the house, not the papers, but proof that I had existed, that I was worth remembering. I spoke directly to the silence, as if to every person who had ever been pushed aside in their own family. Rejection hurts, but your worth isn't theirs to define. You carry it yourself, even when they pretend not to see. George Eliot's words rose in my mind. It's never too late to be what you might have been. The truth of it settled into me like the warmth of the rising sun. I would start over. Stronger. Freer. No apologies. I looked back once at the horizon, then whispered, "They lost a house. I gained my life. And in that trade, I won."